Patricia Langford had always believed the world had its order, and in that order she belonged at the top. First class wasn't just a seat to her, it was a symbol of her place in society. The soft leather, the quiet professionalism, the complimentary drinks served with polished grace. This was her domain. She had earned it, she told herself, through a lifetime of well-maintained appearances, careful investments, and the right social circles. So when she approached her row on a routine flight from Dallas to Washington, D.C., and saw a well-dressed black man seated beside her, something inside her shifted. Not visibly, not outrageously, but uncomfortably. It wasn't that he was loud or unkempt. In fact, he was quite the opposite. His suit was sharp, his posture confident, his fingers moving with quiet focus across the keyboard of a sleek laptop. But that's what unsettled her most. He didn't seem uncertain, grateful, or apologetic to be there. He acted like he belonged. And to Patricia, that subtle assurance felt like a challenge. She had spent decades believing that first class was a curated space, reserved for a certain type of traveler. People like her, successful, sophisticated, predictable. And deep down, she hadn't imagined someone like him fitting that picture. She knew better than to say it aloud. Her upbringing had taught her that much. But her discomfort began to pulse beneath the surface, sharp and persistent. She adjusted in her seat, glancing around as if hoping someone else would notice this subtle breach in the expected social fabric. Her fingers twitched, her heart beat faster. He hadn't even spoken to her, hadn't looked her way, and yet his presence felt intrusive. Not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. A disruption of the silent rules she thought were still in play. It wasn't hate. It was something quieter, more insidious. A bias so deeply ingrained that it wore the mask of reason, of just a feeling. And when she finally leaned toward him and asked if he was in the right seat, she cloaked it in politeness, in concern for a possible mix-up. But the truth was far more uncomfortable. She saw a black man in first class and assumed something had gone wrong. And in that moment, whether she admitted it to herself or not, she revealed something far more telling than any accusation. She hadn't expected him to belong, and that was the beginning of her unraveling. Patricia Langford was no stranger to subtle influence. Words, when carefully chosen, could shape outcomes without ever appearing forceful. It was a skill she had honed over years of board meetings, charity galas, and polite society, where confrontation was frowned upon, but coded language was a currency. So when her discomfort with the man seated beside her, the black man in the impeccable suit so assured in his presence, refused to fade, she resorted to the tools she knew best. Not accusations, implications. Not direct hostility, suggestion. With a slight lift of her hand and a carefully practiced smile, she summoned the flight attendant, cloaking her true intent in civility. "I believe there's been a mix-up," she said, her voice light, laced with amusement. But beneath that smile was purpose. It was the beginning of a calculated effort to remove what she perceived as a problem without ever naming it as such. She didn't say he doesn't belong here. She didn't have to. She trusted the implication would do the work, that someone, anyone, would look at him, look at her, and quietly agree. But when the flight attendant confirmed that he was indeed in the correct seat, Patricia's carefully constructed performance began to fray, and yet she didn't stop. She couldn't. The idea that her discomfort would go unaddressed felt like a loss of control, so she tried again, pressing the call button with fingers that trembled not with fear, but frustration. Her request was the same, only this time delivered in lower tones, with a more serious air. "I just don't feel comfortable." It was a phrase laced with plausible deniability, one that could pass for anything from personal anxiety to subtle accusation. And when that too was dismissed with reason and policy, she escalated again. "I don't feel safe." Those words, heavy with consequence, were not chosen lightly. Patricia knew what they meant, what they could trigger. In a post-9/11 world, on a crowded flight preparing for takeoff, those words were like striking a match in dry grass, and she lit it without flinching. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't pointing fingers. But the intent was clear: make him the problem, turn him into the source of disruption. Her discomfort, unfounded and unspoken, now masqueraded as concern for safety, a tactic she had seen work before. But it didn't land the way she expected. The cabin didn't rally behind her, the flight crew didn't comply. Instead, she found herself standing on a cliff's edge, with her own words echoing back at her. The man beside her hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything but sit in quiet dignity. Yet she had tried to make him invisible, replaceable, disposable, and all with a few carefully chosen words. That's what made it so chilling. How far she was willing to go under the guise of civility, how easily she thought she could bend reality to her comfort. But this time, the world was watching. It was a sentence Patricia had spoken before in different contexts, at charity events, at meetings, in hushed conversations with friends when discussing unfamiliar neighborhoods or unfamiliar people. But never had the words felt as heavy, as calculated as they did now. "I don't feel safe." She said them with measured calm, a tone that feigned vulnerability, yet pulsed with quiet authority. They weren't loud, and they didn't need to be. Patricia knew exactly what they meant in this context, on a plane preparing for takeoff with a black man seated beside her. She wasn't afraid, not truly, but she understood the weight those words carried. It was a statement designed to shift the balance of power, to trigger instinctive responses from those in charge, to cloak herself in concern while casting suspicion on someone who had done absolutely nothing, and Daniel knew it. The flight attendant knew it. Everyone within earshot felt it. The cabin air tightened as her sentence hung there, not shouted, but sharp enough to pierce the calm. It was the oldest trick in the book, delivered with the newest of smiles. Patricia folded her hands in her lap, her body language serene, but her words were weaponized. The brilliance of it, or so she thought, was that she didn't have to accuse him outright. "I just don't feel comfortable. I don't feel safe." She left the rest to interpretation, relying on deeply ingrained societal fears and assumptions to do the heavy lifting. In her mind, she wasn't being cruel. She was being cautious, rational, deserving of accommodation, and when the flight attendant asked, "Are you saying you feel threatened?" Patricia gave the smallest shrug, her head tilted just enough to suggest concern without claiming responsibility. Let them fill in the blanks, she thought. Let them be the ones to act. But this time, the performance didn't land. The quiet murmurs around her weren't nods of agreement, they were whispers of disbelief. A woman across the aisle lifted her phone. A businessman muttered, "Here we go again." The crew didn't scramble to reassure her or move Daniel. Instead, they looked at her with measured doubt. Something was different. For the first time in her carefully managed world, Patricia's words were not enough. Her familiar tools, coded language, selective phrasing, genteel manipulation, were failing her. And worst of all, Daniel still hadn't reacted. He didn't shift uncomfortably or try to appease her. He simply looked at her, calm, still, and completely unmoved. That unnerved her more than anything, because in his silence, he denied her what she craved: validation, submission, the reinforcement of the narrative she had quietly constructed. And now, under the scrutiny of fellow passengers and the lens of a recording phone, Patricia wasn't just the uncomfortable woman in first class. She was being seen for what she truly was. The fear she pretended to feel had nowhere to hide, and for the first time, she was the one who felt truly unsafe. Not because of who sat beside her, but because the world was no longer playing along. The moment Daniel reached into his pocket, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. His movements were deliberate, no rush, no anger, no drama, just quiet control. Patricia watched, her heart thudding against her ribs, a flicker of confusion crossing her face that quickly morphed into unease. He pulled out a slim leather case and with one smooth motion flipped it open. The gold FBI badge inside caught the overhead light, and, in that instant, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Passengers who had been quietly observing now leaned forward. A few gasped. Someone across the aisle muttered, "Oh, wow." And Patricia, who had spent the past 20 minutes trying to assert dominance with carefully chosen words and subtle insinuations, suddenly felt like the floor beneath her had vanished. It wasn't just shock, it was exposure. Unfiltered, undeniable exposure. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Would you like to file an official complaint, ma'am?" he asked, his voice steady, almost gentle, but laced with something unmistakable: accountability. His eyes were locked on hers, not with anger, but with clarity. Patricia froze. Every part of her body stiffened, her hands still clenched in her lap. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had expected deference, discomfort, maybe even compliance. But instead, she was staring at a federal badge and a man who clearly didn't fear her subtle threats or whispered implications. It wasn't just a badge, it was a mirror, reflecting everything she had tried to conceal beneath polite smiles and false concern. Her words, "I don't feel safe," now felt foolish, dangerous, exposed. The power she thought she had wielded with such care had backfired in an instant, and now the entire cabin could see it. Some were filming, others were shaking their heads. But no one was on her side anymore. She could feel it in the way people looked at her. Like they knew. Like they'd seen this performance before. Daniel remained still, badge open in one hand, eyes unwavering. He wasn't asking out of malice, he was giving her a chance to double down or to back down. And Patricia, for all her pride, couldn't lie to herself anymore. She had misjudged him, misjudged the moment, misjudged the world she thought she still controlled. Slowly, shakily, she shook her head. "No," she whispered, "no complaint." Daniel gave a small nod, closed the badge, and returned to his laptop like nothing had happened. But everything had. The roles were no longer what they had been. The woman who had tried to unseat him with whispers now sat powerless, exposed. And the man she tried to diminish had risen, not through retaliation, but through truth. The flight hadn't even left the ground, and yet Patricia Langford's world was already spiraling. As she sat rigidly in her first-class seat, still reeling from the quiet humiliation of Daniel's badge and the sudden reversal of power, she became aware of something far more terrifying: the soft glow of a phone screen aimed subtly in her direction. The young woman across the aisle was no longer pretending to text, she was recording, and Patricia knew, without a doubt, that the damage had already begun. A sharp chime echoed from the phone. A few quick taps, a smirk, and then it was out there. Online, irreversible, out of her hands. The caption was short, merciless, and impossible to misinterpret. "Racist woman tries to remove black man from first class, then learns he's FBI." Her heart pounded. She tried to steady her breath, but it was like drowning in dry air. She opened her bag with trembling fingers and pulled out her phone, hoping, praying that it hadn't gained traction yet. But the notifications were already piling in. Her name, her face, her voice, all of it, captured, uploaded, consumed. The video had barely been online for 5 minutes, and yet the view count was already climbing. 8,000, 12,000, 1,000, 18,000. Her hand shook. She clicked into the comments, foolishly hoping for understanding. Instead, she was met with a torrent of outrage and ridicule, entitled and exposed. She really thought she'd win this one. Hope her job sees this. Her job. Her mind went white. The Marston Foundation, the charity board, her decades of careful image cultivation, gone in the blink of a lens and the press of a button. Her phone buzzed violently in her hand. Texts from colleagues, vague at first: "Is this you? Please tell me this isn't real." Then came the calls, friends, her sister, even her financial advisor. But she couldn't answer. What would she say? That it was all a misunderstanding? That she hadn't meant to sound the way she did? No one would believe her now, not with video evidence and the court of public opinion already in session. Her throat burned. Her vision blurred. Across from her, Daniel typed peacefully, his badge now tucked away as though nothing had happened. He had returned to his work, untouched by the storm he had every right to unleash. Patricia, on the other hand, sat unraveling, her hands clammy, her face burning, her mind cycling through panic and regret. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was annihilation. She had lost control of the story. The words she once used to shape perception had become shackles, and there was no undoing them. She had spent a lifetime mastering decorum, image, and grace under pressure. But now, under the unflinching eye of the internet, none of that mattered. The public didn't want her excuses, they wanted accountability, and the terrifying truth settled in her chest like stone. They weren't wrong. The moment the plane touched down, Patricia Langford felt like she was bracing for a storm, one she had unknowingly summoned. Her pulse pounded in her ears as the landing gear screeched against the tarmac, but the real noise was inside her. The whirring thoughts, the rising panic, the unbearable silence from everyone around her. She didn't wait for the seatbelt light to blink off. The second it did, she grabbed her handbag with trembling hands and pushed her way down the narrow aisle, desperate to escape. Passengers parted, some silently judging, others openly watching. No one offered her a sympathetic glance. The air had changed. She was no longer an anonymous woman in first class. She was that woman. But the worst was waiting for her at the terminal. As the automatic doors opened into the arrivals hall of Reagan National Airport, Patricia stopped cold. A small group of reporters, just a few, not yet a mob, stood near baggage claim, holding phones and microphones. One of them was already speaking into a camera. The now viral video shows a woman attempting to have a black man, later identified as an FBI agent, removed from first class, citing discomfort. The video has garnered over 1 million views in under 6 hours. 1 million. The number hit her like a physical blow. She tried to move quickly, turning her head, hoping no one had noticed her yet. But one reporter's eyes lit up in recognition, and before Patricia could even pivot away, she heard the words she had feared most. "Wait, wait! That's her!" Panic flooded her chest. Her heels clicked frantically against the tile floor as she rushed toward the exit, eyes lowered, heart pounding. She shoved past travelers, past carts and signage, her breath coming in shallow gasps. A voice called behind her. "Miss Langford, do you have a response to the video?" But she didn't turn around. She couldn't. A cab slowed at the curb and she practically dove into the back seat. "Go!" she snapped, her voice tight and shaky. The driver gave her a look through the mirror but said nothing as he pulled away from the chaos. Only then did she exhale, pressing the heels of her hands to her temples. Her head throbbed, her stomach churned. She had spent years building her reputation, carefully curating her image in social and professional circles, nurturing an aura of elegance and leadership. But in one afternoon, less than 2 hours really, she had undone it all. And not because someone had wronged her, not because of some misunderstanding or smear campaign. No, she had done it to herself. That truth sat heavy and immovable in her chest. Her phone vibrated again. A number she didn't recognize flashed on the screen. She hesitated, then swiped to answer. "Miss Langford, this is James Rollins, chair of the Marston Foundation," came the clipped voice. "I assume you're aware of the situation." She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. "We'll be issuing a public statement by morning," he continued. "We expect your resignation before then." Patricia blinked. "James, This is being taken out of context." "The board disagrees," he said firmly. "Good night." The line went dead. Patricia lowered the phone slowly, staring blankly out the cab window. Her breath trembled. It was done. The board she had served for years gone. Her public identity shattered. Her name now trended online, not for accolades or accomplishments, but as a cautionary tale, and no one cared why. No one wanted her explanation. The video was enough. She leaned her head back, eyes burning. There would be no statement that could fix this, no PR spin to recover from it. Because this wasn't just a scandal, this was consequence. And it had finally come for her. While Patricia's world crumbled under the weight of public disgrace, Daniel Stokes remained unshaken. He walked through the terminal not with arrogance, but with quiet composure, his gait steady, his expression neutral, almost unreadable. He had been the target of assumptions, of judgment, of an attempted humiliation wrapped in politeness. And yet he had not flinched, not once. For him, this wasn't unfamiliar territory. It was not the first time someone had questioned his place, his presence, his right to simply exist in a space society still tried to gatekeep. But unlike Patricia, Daniel didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His calm had done the speaking. His truth had done the work. And now, while news anchors dissected a viral video, while hashtags trended and reputations burned, Daniel was already somewhere else, perhaps at a meeting, sipping his coffee, typing quietly, his badge tucked away but never far. Back on the plane, his silence had been misread. Patricia thought it was weakness, thought it was submission. She mistook stillness for uncertainty, restraint for powerlessness. But it was neither. It was strength, refined, composed, and sharpened by a lifetime of being underestimated. Daniel had seen it before. The suspicious glances, the unspoken questions, the discomfort dressed up as concern. And yet, what made him extraordinary was not his job title or the flash of his badge. It was his refusal to play her game. He hadn't cowered. He hadn't explained himself to satisfy her discomfort. He had waited, measured, and then with perfect timing, he had revealed the truth. Without anger, without vengeance, just fact. And that fact shattered the illusion Patricia had tried to maintain. She had expected to be the victor in a silent, unspoken battle, but she had been playing chess against someone who didn't even see the board the same way. Daniel wasn't there to win an argument or prove a point. He simply existed as he had every right to, and that, in the end, was what unraveled her. While she spiraled through guilt and regret, while her hands shook with every text, every missed call, Daniel moved forward, unbothered, unmoved. For him, it was just another Tuesday. And for Patricia, it was the day everything fell apart, not because of something he did, but because of something she revealed about herself. Her words had exposed more than she intended. Her actions had spoken louder than any excuse she could later offer, and the contrast was devastating. One person at peace with who they were, the other unable to reckon with who they'd become when no one was supposed to be watching. In the end, Daniel didn't need to punish her. The truth did that on its own. In a world that's changing faster than many of us could have imagined, this story is a powerful reminder that character still matters and that the truth always finds its way to the surface. It teaches us that assumptions, no matter how quietly they're made, carry weight. Words spoken with subtle bias can do real harm, and sometimes it's not about what is said, but what is meant. For older generations who have witnessed vast social changes over decades, this story calls us to reflect on how power, privilege, and prejudice can quietly shape our actions if we're not careful. It reminds us that dignity lies not in status, but in how we treat others, especially when we think no one is watching. Daniel's quiet strength shows us that grace under pressure can dismantle even the deepest assumptions, while Patricia's downfall is a cautionary tale. Reputation built over years can unravel in moments if we act without humility. In our later years, we carry wisdom, but we must also carry the courage to unlearn, to grow, and to see the humanity in everyone, not just those who look or live like we do. That, perhaps, is the legacy worth leaving behind.